Benjamin's story in last week's Sunday paper provides a local example for a challenge that we face as a nation. Bryan Stevenson describes some of these problems in his book, Just Mercy, which was recommended this year in our faith as an all read across our congregations, and some of us read it together last month. Stevenson is a lawyer, and he's the executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative. It's a nonprofit that litigates on behalf of people wrongly convicted or charged, people who are poor and have been denied effective representation, and others whose trials are marked by racial discrimination or prosecutorial misconduct. I wish that I could share all of the stories in this book with you, because they each deserve to be heard and witnessed and transformed. The story I have chosen to share with you is incredibly painful, and I want to tell it the way that he does, mostly to illustrate to you the reality of some people's experience with our justice system. And while it's heartbreaking for anyone to hear, for those of us in the room who've experienced physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, it will be especially upsetting. So I invite you to take care of yourself and breathe. That as we receive Trina Garnett's story, let us also receive a glimpse of the human spirit's strength to survive, as well as its susceptibility to being diminished. Trina Garnett was the youngest of 12 children living in the poorest section of Chester, Pennsylvania. Trina's father, Walter, was a former boxer whose failed career had turned him into a violent, abusive alcoholic, well known to local police for throwing a punch with little provocation. Trina's mother, Edith, became sick after bearing so many children, 12, some of whom were conceived by rapes from her husband. Trina's father would strip her mother naked in front of the children, beating her until she writhed on the floor, while her children looked on fearfully. When she lost consciousness during the beatings, Walter would shove a stick down her throat to revive her for more abuse. When Trina was a toddler, she became seriously ill after ingesting lighter fluid while left unattended. At age 5, she accidentally set herself on fire, resulting in severe burns over her chest, stomach, and back. She was in the hospital for weeks as they did painful skin grafts. Trina's mother died when she was just 9 years old. Her older sisters tried to take care of her, but when Walter began sexually abusing them, they fled the home. After that, Walter began to focus on Trina and her twin sisters. And so these girls also ran away from home. They began roaming the streets of Chester. Trina and her sisters would eat out of garbage cans, or for days would find nothing to eat. They slept in parks and public bathrooms. And when the girls went to stay with their older sister, one of whom had gotten married, her husband began sexually abusing them. All of this exacerbated Trina's emotional and mental health problems. She would sometimes become so distraught and ill that her sisters would find a way to get her to the local hospital to be cared for. But because she was penniless, she was never allowed to stay long enough to recover or find stability. Mind you, she's not even 14 yet. One night when she was 14, she and her friend climbed through the window of a row house to talk to the boys who lived inside. Trina lit matches to light the way so she could find their room. But the house caught on fire, and it spread quickly. 2 boys sleeping in the home died from asphyxiation. Their mother accused Trina of starting the fire intentionally, but Trina and her friend insisted that it was an accident. Trina was so traumatized by the boy's death that she could hardly speak when the police arrested her. She was so non-functional and listless that her lawyer thought she was incompetent to stand trial. but her lawyer failed to file the appropriate paperwork and motions to present evidence to support an incompetency determination. Her lawyer, who was subsequently disbarred and jailed for unrelated criminal misconduct, he also never challenged the state's decision to try Trina as an adult. So as a result, Trina was forced to stand trial for second-degree murder in an adult courthouse. At trial, her friend testified against her in exchange for the charges being dropped against her, and Trina was convicted of second-degree murder. During sentencing, the judge found that Trina had no intent to kill, but under the Pennsylvania law, the judge could not take absence of intent into account during sentencing. He could also not consider Trina's age, her mental illness, the poverty she had endured, the abuse she had suffered, or the tragic circumstances surrounding the fire. Pennsylvania's sentencing law was inflexible. For those convicted of second-degree murder, mandatory life imprisonment without the possibility of parole was the only possibility. The judge expressed serious misgivings about the sentence he was forced to impose, writing that this is the saddest case I've ever seen. For a tragic crime committed at age 14 on accident, Trina was condemned to die in prison. It's not surprising that shortly after she arrived in the women's prison, a male correctional officer raped her. The crime was discovered when Trina became pregnant. As often is the case, the correctional officer was fired, but not criminally prosecuted. Let's just remember that at this point, she's like 16 years old. Trina remained imprisoned and gave birth to a son. Like hundreds of women who give birth while in prison, Trina was completely unprepared for the stress of childbirth. She delivered her baby while handcuffed to a bed. Her baby boy was then taken away immediately and placed in foster care. After the series of events, the fire, the imprisonment, the rape, the traumatic birthing experience, and the seizure of her son, Trina's mental health deteriorated even further. Over the years, she became less functional and more mentally disabled. Her body began to spasm and quiver uncontrollably until she required a cane and then a wheelchair. By the time she had turned 30, prison doctors diagnosed her with multiple sclerosis, intellectual disability, and mental illness related to trauma. Let's take a breath and hold in our hearts the tragedy of how some people treated Trina Garnett. Let's take another breath and hold both the strength and vulnerability of her spirit and of the boys who died. I wish I could tell you when you leave here today, you can just leave her story in here because it's unique, and so we can just dismiss it. It's an aberration. She had a bad lawyer. She just got bad circumstances and over again, and that she is not a common statistic or representation of people in our prisons. But that's just not true. Stevenson reports that she's just one of thousands of children hidden away in adult prisons, largely unknown and forgotten, who are preoccupied with surviving in terrifying environments. I wish I could say that her sentence is unusual, that compared to other youth who are convicted of crimes, she just had a really harsh time, but Stevenson found that we tend to treat our youth more harshly than we treat our adults. He noted, most adults convicted of the kinds of crimes which Trina was charged with in other states are not sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Adults who are charged with the same crime in a federal court usually receive sentences that permit release in less than 25 years. Many adults convicted of attempted murder in Florida serve less than 10 years in prison. But Trina is not unique. She's one of nearly 500 people in Pennsylvania who've been condemned to life imprisonment for crimes they committed while they were an adolescent. It is the largest population of child offenders condemned to die in prison in any single jurisdiction in the world. It's only within the last 6 years that our Supreme Court found that life imprisonment imposed on children convicted of non-homicide or even homicidal crimes is cruel and unusual punishment and is constitutionally impermissible. That only happened in the last 6 years. Even though this ruling impacted over 2,000 people who were already incarcerated, convicted of crimes committed during adolescence, many judges simply just turned their sentences from lifetime imprisonment without the possibility of parole into sentences of 175 years. Trina is not unique. I wish I could say, well, at least other mentally ill youth or adults who are charged with crimes are not treated as harshly as she was, but I cannot. Stevenson reports that over 50% of inmates in the United States have a diagnosed mental illness, a rate that's nearly 5 times greater than the general population. In fact, there are more than 3 times the number of seriously mental ill individuals in jail or prison than in hospitals. In some states, it's 10 times higher, the number of people in jail than in a hospital. Trina is not unique. How is Trina not unique? How is this happening? Stevenson asks, why do we want to kill all the broken people? What is wrong with us that we think a thing like that can be right? We must think we're making us, whatever this us is, safer, but we're fooling ourselves. Nearly all prisoners will return to their communities at some point. The Bureau of Justice Statistics reports that about 600,000 people are released from prison each year. Since 1990, 600,000 people a year for the last 16 years. There are almost 5 million ex-offenders under some form of community-based supervision in our country right now. 5 million. We are not making ourselves safer by incarcerating more people than any other country in the world. There's a TED Talk I came across where a neuroscientist talks about the neuroscience of restorative justice. His name is Daniel Riesel. And he explains from a neuroscientist perspective why we need to change society's mindset about what safety and justice really are. And he notes that while we've changed many of our social institutions over time as we've learned about human development and psychology, one that we refuse to rethink is our criminal justice system. He says we've allowed ourselves to believe that human nature cannot be changed, and as a society that is costing us dearly. At first, Riesel studied prisoners who were clinically diagnosed as psychopaths. And they wanted to see what underlied their condition and what, if anything, could be done to prevent it or to cure it. And so to do this, they studied the inmates and they looked at how they responded to images of people feeling different feelings. They would show a picture of somebody who looked sad, and then they would monitor their physical reactions, as well as ask the inmate what they noticed. And upon seeing the images, many people, Riesel said, they had instantly a slight normal people, non-diagnosed psychopath people, I shouldn't say normal, but many people who did not have that diagnosis, when they saw the image, they would instantly have a slight, measurable physical response, increased heart rate, perhaps, sweating on their skin. While the people who were diagnosed as psychopaths in our study, he said, were able to describe the pictures accurately, but they failed to show the emotions required or any kind of physical response. So they decided to do an MRI to image their brains while they were looking at these photos to see what might be going on. And they found that these individuals were not just victims of a troubled childhood. They had a deficit in the area of the brain called the amygdala. And normally, the more empathic a person is, the larger and more active the amygdala will be. But he said our population of inmates had a deficient amygdala, which likely led to their lack of empathy and to their immoral behavior. Riesel then moved to studying mice, to study what, if anything, might encourage generation of cells in the amygdala, or what might cause its decline. And he reported, if you rear a mouse in a shoebox with cotton wool, alone and without much stimulation, not only does it not thrive, but it will develop strange, repetitive behaviors. The natural sociable animal will lose its ability to bond with other mice, even becoming aggressive when introduced to them. However, mice reared in what we would call an enriched environment, a large habitation with other mice, with wheels and ladders to explore and engage, they would demonstrate neurogenesis, the birth of new brain cells. And as we showed, they also performed better on a range of learning and memory tasks. He says, now they don't develop the morality, which might lead them to carrying the shopping bags of another little mouse across the streets. But their improved results in healthy sociable behavior were noticeable. Mice reared in a standard cage, by contrast, not dissimilarly, you might say, from a prison cell, have dramatically lower levels of neurons, new neurons in the brain. Riesel said it's now clear that animals and mammals like humans can show neurogenesis. In some areas of the brain, more than 20% of cells are newly formed, even into adulthood. He says, however, our brains are also exquisitely sensitive to stress in our environment, which suppresses the growth of new cells. The more stress, the less brain development, which in turn causes less adaptability and higher stress levels, and it cycles. This is the interplay between nature and nurture right in front of our eyes. When you think about it, he says, it's ironic that our current solution for people with stressed amygdala is to place them in an environment that actually inhibits any further chance of growth. He concludes, we need to change our view of a convicted criminal as someone who is wholly irredeemable. Because if we see someone as wholly irredeemable, how are they going to see themselves? Seeing others as whole and redeemable is one of the aims of restorative justice. Let's quickly recall the story that we shared with the children this morning about the high school students and their turkeys. They got caught up in their prank and their group mentality, and they took it too far, and they were humiliated afterwards. They felt shame just walking down the street. Their community chose to address the harms of their actions rather than just enforce some rules and focus on the laws that were broken. And in this way, the custodian's needs weren't lost in the shuffle. It's allowed him, in turn, to even come to the place where he could offer support back to the youth. Knowing that they had understood, that they felt remorse and accepted responsibility, he was able to extend respect back to them. By using a circle process, the community showed equal concern and commitment to both the victims and the offenders, involving both in the process of justice. Restorative justice recognizes that while the consequences for the offender might be difficult to meet, the consequences should not be intended as harm to the offenders, but rather as something that's restorative and actually achievable. Respect is shown to all parties, including the victims, the offenders, and the justice colleagues leading the process. Imagine how different their outcome would have been if they'd simply been taken into custody. I believe that youth involved in the juvenile justice system experience substantial breaks, but I don't agree with the way that our Polk County attorney defines the breaks that they receive. And it's definitely not coming in the form of their sentencing. In fact, the Register, as they researched Brown's story that was shared in our reading, they learned that Iowa has the harshest sentencing law for robbery in the Midwest. If we don't change the way we respond to youth committing crimes and acting out, we will cause breaks, substantial breaks, to happen in their lives. Breaks in their families, in their relationships, their education, the continuing formation of their brains, and thus their ability to adapt and succeed in life. They will experience breaks in the sanctity of their bodies and their sexuality, in their trust of humanity, the trustworthiness of society, breaks in their own sense of self-worth, breaking of their overall spirit and appreciation of life. Between 1990 and 2005, a new prison opened every 10 days in the United States. A new prison every 10 days in the United States. What would happen if every 10 days in the United States a restorative justice center was opened, fully staffed and funded? What would happen? I want to see that happen. I don't want to read books about these heartbreaking stories. Our church is taking efforts to make that happen. Many of you have already signed up. We have a full docket. We're trying to figure out what to do. We're going to be training people in the circle process here in our church. There's also another training happening May 12th to 14th. I hope these are just the first of what will be many trainings so that we learn how to embody and feel confident to practice alternative ways of responding to conflict and to harm, ways that we can actually have some kind of consequences for behavior that promote the values we seek to see in the person rather than just harming them further, especially our youth, putting them way before. I don't know who's able to really function or cope with prison, but how are our children going to be able to do that? I'm willing to do what I can to change the kind of breaks that we offer our kids. How about you?